Dueling Stories of the 16th Century, written by Brantome, translated by George Powell, and read to you by Michael Lentz of Memory Medieval. You can find more of my work at Memory Medieval on YouTube and on X. There are a couple things that you should know before I begin reading the book, which I will do from beginning to end in its original translation. The first is that this book was written in the late 1500s, early 1600s, and then was translated into English in the early 1900s. So now, almost 100 years later, I'm reading an older English translation of an even older French book. So there may be some linguistic, let's just call it complications. It's not going to necessarily read exactly like a modern book. Also, as an American, please accept my apology in advance for butchering some of the French pronunciations. And on that note, it is not going to be divided like a normal modern book either. There's actually no chapters or no real breaks. It sort of reads as if you were sitting down with your grandfather and he was just telling you stories. And so the book is going to sort of read as one long conversation with Grandpa. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I've actually enjoyed it quite a lot. And so with that, I present to you Brantome's Dueling Stories of the 16th Century. Brantome's attention had long since been drawn in numerous discussions among specialists to the question of courtesies as practiced in duels. Ought they be allowed, or ought the rigor of the law to prevail? It was the Danes and the Lombards who first brought the combat à outrance into such vogue, though the fashion had been only too faithfully and rigorously handed down among Christians, especially in the time of Charlemagne, who himself made laws which were much in use among the French and Italians. There was no question of courtesy in those days. A man had to enter the lists, resolved to conquer or die. Seeing that by those aforesaid Danish and Lombard laws, the conqueror did just what he pleased with his unsuccessful opponent. Thus he had the right to drag him about the field, hang, burn, keep him prisoner, treat him worse than any slave. Such was the position of the conquered. It was thought that this idea of dragging your enemy about the lists might have been borrowed from the example of a certain Homeric hero, Achilles, to wit, who is recorded to have dragged the body of Hector at the tail of his chariot 3 times round the field of battle, in token of his triumphant and glorious victory. Well, Brantome had heard of a brave and valiant lord some 50 years before who had entered the lists, in the fullest determination to treat his enemy in this very manner. An enemy, too, who was by no means his equal in strength and prowess. But the Almighty took the side of the weaker, and would not give victory to the strong man, who could not have had it but of him. The design, in consequence, never came off, ne pris fut. It was at the time when Henry II came to the throne that there was a duel fought at Sedan between the Baron de Guerre and the Lord de Fendille, about a quarrel they had the very day His Majesty entered Paris. The subject was one unsuited for any other form of discussion. It is enough to say that the insult was deadly. Fendille was a fine young fellow in the train of the Vidame de Chartres, who stood for the very flower of chivalry at the court in those days. The Baron, on the other hand, had been page to King Francis and born in Lorraine, though his forebears were of Basque or Bernese origin, for as Monsieur de Montluc tells us, King René of Sicily, Duke of Lorraine and Anjou, was mighty fond of Gascons and gentlemen from those parts, and gave employment to many of them, so that not a few married and settled there, and left a goodly offspring. Well, these two brave fellows, to settle their affair, seeing that apology or reconciliation was out of the question, the baron's honor was too nearly touched for that, applied to King Henry to appoint them a place for combat. The king, however, mindful of the oath he had sworn after the affair of La Chastaigneraye and the extreme distress felt at his death, flatly refused anything of the kind. All these things, by the way, Brantome regarded as predestined by fate. Apart from that, the king ought certainly to have prevented this contest. He did not, however, and we are to note that the king himself, like the dear friend whose rights he should have asserted, for Chastaigneraye was, in a way, fighting in defense of the royal honor, both perished in what might be called single combat. However, to return to our two duelists, on the king's refusal, they applied to Monsieur de Bouillon to let them fight at Sedan, a request which he, as absolute sovereign in his own territory, granted willingly enough. And on the appointed day, they appeared punctually with all their relations and friends, seconds, supporters, and what-not, according to the laws, ceremonies, and usages required. The point of the story, however, is that the young de Fendille would not hear of entering the lists, ferocious young braggart that he was, till he had seen a fire lighted and a gallows got ready to hang and burn his enemy after the victory, of which he made so certain. However, fortune failed him, as has been said, and he was far from being as victorious as he expected, though on the other hand he could not be said exactly to have been worsted. Both parties wore armor, and for offensive weapons de Guerre had chosen a short, thick kind of sword called a bastard, in the use of which he was very skilled, having had lessons from a certain priest who was a noted master of fence. It is true that Monsieur le Vidame, Fendille's second, raised a question as to this particular weapon, alleging that it could not be included under the definition weapons such as are used among cavaliers and gentlemen of honor. It was replied, however, that the Swiss, well known as a warlike people, used no other sword but this kind. So as Monsieur de Chartres had abundant confidence in the courage of his young principal, the dispute went no further. Thus, when all proper formalities had been observed, they entered the lists, and at the first assault Fendille delivered such a thrust at the thigh of the Baron de Guerre as laid it completely open. The Baron, feeling that his strength was rapidly failing from loss of blood, bethought himself of using his skill as a wrestler. In this also it seems he had been specially instructed by a little Breton priest, almoner of the Cardinal de Lenoncourt. So he closed with his antagonist and bore him to the ground, and there the two lay and struggled. Both parties had discarded their weapons for the wrestle, the Baron uppermost, using his hands and clenched fists for all he was worth, but feeling all the while that it was too little purpose, as he was losing blood so rapidly and getting weaker every moment. At this crisis in the combat, however, a singular accident occurred in the fall of a scaffolding, on which a great many spectators, ladies, young ladies, and gentlemen, were sitting to watch this cruel pastime. Perhaps Brantome thought they were duly punished for their inhumanity. Anyhow, the confusion which followed was so great from the accident and the shrieks and cries of the sufferers that people did not know whether, that is, to see out the duel or to go and rescue the ladies who were stifling and trampling one another to death. However, some of the supporters of de Guerre had at last a happy and practical thought. They seized the occasion of all this disturbance and hullabaloo to call out to their embarrassed champion, "Throw some gravel in his eyes and mouth." The Baron, wounded as he was, had strength enough left to execute this simple maneuver, and so reduced his haughty young antagonist to a shameful surrender. At least, so the Baron's supporters said. It is to be noted, however, that apart from the peculiar opportunity offered by the accident, they would have never dared to think of such a breach of all the law and etiquette of dueling, which rigorously forbade spectators to speak, nay, even to cough, sneeze, or make any kind of noise or sign which could attract attention. Also, that the confusion and noise did not operate purely in favor of the one party. On the contrary, the supporters of the unfortunate Fendille indignantly denied that he had surrendered or that they had ever heard any such words uttered, which was indeed likely enough. De Guerre was determined to inflict upon his opponent the full penalty which the latter had intended for him. The seconds of Fendille vehemently asserted that he had no such right. So finally, after much angry disputation on the matter, Monsieur de Bouillon, who was judge, taking counsel of other military authorities about him, decided that the affair should go no further, as the main point was somewhat doubtful and there was really a great deal to be said on both sides. Brantome appears to console himself with the reflection that both parties fought very bravely, and the conquered man, in particular, distinguished himself afterwards in many a gallant service to his king, and finally fell during the assault on Cauny, when that place was besieged by the Marshal de Brissac, being one of the first to mount the breach and being killed at the very summit. The story, we are told, serves to illustrate, but does it, the ignominies that could be inflicted by the victor on the vanquished, because if there had not been something a little obscure about the case, no one could doubt that the Baron would have burnt his opponent, as he had a perfect right to do. But perhaps this was not the wish of the Almighty, the quarrel being unjust. Olivier de la Marche, in his lifetime, noted as a gentle cavalier, well skilled with sword and pen, major domo to the Archduke Philip, Count of Flanders, tells us in his memoirs of a combat that took place in his time at Valenciennes before the good Duke Philip, which was certainly amusing on account of the curious and absurd ceremonies observed, though as to the result, that was serious enough, seeing that the conquered man was killed and hanged. It turned on the question of an ancient privilege accorded long ago by the emperors and counts of Hainault in the aforesaid city of Valenciennes, that whenever anyone had killed another in fair fight, de beau fait, that was the term used, and Brantome highly approved it, that is to say, man to man, and with no trickery nor cheating, he could demand the freedom of the city on being prepared to maintain with shield and cudgel that he had killed his man properly, and has been said, and as a gentleman should, that the freedom was conferred on him and no one could raise any claim against him on the ground of the first quarrel unless they were prepared to assert and maintain it in the same way, according to the law of the city. So says Monsieur Olivier. Well, it chanced that one Mahiot had killed a relative of Jacotin Pluvier, and the said Mahiot was prosecuted for this before the courts of the city, Jacotin alleging that his said relative had been killed by treachery and not in fair fight at all. Accordingly, a single combat was authorized by the townspeople, according to their right, not by the Duke Philip, sovereign though he was. There was a great crowd present, but never a word or sound durst they utter. The person who kept order had a rod, and cried out, "Where the ban? Guerre la ban," so that everybody kept quiet for his life, for fear of the law. The lists were a round enclosure, with a large entrance and 2 chairs, one at each end, covered with black. Note that point, for the 2 combatants to sit upon while waiting. But before they began, a missal was brought in on which both of them took the oath. That was a very ancient usage. Both were dressed alike in boiled leather, sewn tightly around the person, body, legs, and arms, with their heads shaved, their feet bare, and the nails on hands and feet carefully pared. This was on account of the hold in wrestling. Brantome could not understand why no mention is made of the beard, a dangerous handle when it is long and thick, as commonly worn in those days, a fashion beginning to revive in the writer's own time. For defensive arms, each bore a shield with the point projecting above. Only nobles, we are to observe, were allowed to carry one with the point below. The offensive weapon was a stout cudgel of medlar wood, of which they make excellent balls for the game of Pall Mall at Naples. Before joining the fray, the combatants were provided with three things: sugar, cinders, and oil. Sugar, the morsels were carefully weighed too, to put in the mouth and suck to help them get their breath. Oil, of course, to make the body slippery and difficult to clutch, after the fashion of wrestlers in Turkey. And cinders, though we can't help thinking sand would have been better, to enable them to hold their shields and staves securely. All the three articles were tested in their presence, would you believe it, as if they had been a couple kings or princes. Nevertheless, all the preparations led to very little, for MacLeod, at the very first onset, flung a handful of the aforesaid gravel in the face of Jacotin, at the same moment dealing him a sturdy blow on the headpiece which brought blood. Jacotin, however, who perhaps had the wit to shut his eyes, was not so easily disposed of, and presently gouged out those of his opponent, jumping upon him as he, MacLeod, lay flat on the ground. He then, though it would scarcely seem necessary, dealt him a stunning blow and kicked him out of the lists. The wretched maimed creature was thereupon solemnly condemned by the judges to be taken to the gibbet and hanged. And there was an end of the duel. The reader who wants to know more may consult the original authority. We should expect to find more than one of Brantome's anecdotes concerned with the vindication of female honor. The true chivalry, needless to say, has to be illustrated from the past. One has to turn back to an ancient, if veracious, chronicle, for example, to read how it was decreed by the Parliament of Paris that the Lord of Carouge, in the time of Charles VI, should fight in single combat against a squire called Degree, accused of having done an unbearable wrong to the signor's lady during his absence in the Holy Land. It is only too certain that crusades in an age where moral and social restraints were not all they should be lent themselves to this kind of abuse. Yet it seems strange that the lady who drove to the spectacle in a chariot was ordered by the king to dismount and placed upon a scaffold draped in black because she was guilty. Even Brantome seems to have thought this rather hard measure till her innocence was proved. There the poor creature sat accordingly, waiting the mercy of God and the chance of war. Those who have not read this moving story in the original will be glad to learn that Carouge vanquished the enemy, forced him to confess everything, and promptly had him hanged on the gallows, which was all ready as usual, while the lady was acquitted and covered with glory. The modern reader may be unable to follow these very sudden moral transformations, but at the time everyone was satisfied, and the whole scene was represented on an old tapestry in the king's apartment at Blois, where the narrator had seen it one day when the story was being explained to His Majesty Charles IX, who was much interested in such things, as indeed who would not be. The combatants, by the way, wore the usual defensive armor covering all the body and carried maces, just like those used by the 100 gentlemen who were called becs de Corbin, besides the short, thick sword, a sort of large dagger, which hangs by your side. A more modern example of this kind of combat is cited from the tragical stories of Bandul, where we read how the Signor de Mendoza, after bravely defending the honor of the Duchess of Savoy, did just the same thing with the Count de Pencalier, that is, made him undergo the very penalty he had prepared for the unfortunate Duchess before entering the field. For in that case, too, the gibbet and the fire were all ready for their victim, but for a just cause and the good sword of Mendoza, who forced the Count to confess his villainy and then put him to the death he deserved. Brantome thought this a very fine story. It is less true, perhaps, to say that there were few like it, though it is rather difficult to understand how persons like Count Pencalier ventured to go about slandering respectable women in this casual fashion, when a champion, with perhaps all the latent forces of Providence behind him, might spring up at any moment. At any rate, we are immediately confronted with a more remarkable example, though it is true, belonging to a much earlier date. It was in the time of Louis the Stammerer that the spouse of a certain Ingelgarius, Count of Chastaigneraye, awoke one morning, like the youthful bride of Attila, to find her husband dead by her side. In great distress, she summoned all the household, gentlemen, cavaliers, ladies, young and old, to see this piteous spectacle. But there was one among them, Gontran, a certain relative of the Count's, who did not stop at the expression of surprise or sympathy. He openly accused the Countess of complicity in the death of her husband, indeed of having the worst of motives for such a crime. The king heard of this and summoned both Gontran and the lady to his presence, for he much loved the deceased count. The arguments on both sides having been heard, the case resolved itself into one of circumstantial evidence. Gontran accordingly challenged the lady, or anyone who would fight for her to disprove his accusation. She made a solemn oath that it was false, but not content with that, her accuser offered to maintain his charge against any champion who would come forward and to prove in person, par son corps, that it was so. This, the reader will understand, was in the eyes of the tribunal the next thing to ocular demonstration of the fact. Well, the matter was long and carefully debated and discussed, the final conclusion being that, as the accused had made this offer, there was no alternative, by the custom of the realm of France, but for the countess to find some champion who would accept it in her defense. At this sentence, we read, the lady was greatly astonished. Possibly she was so far in advance of her generation as to suppose that innocence might be presumed till guilt was proved. Medieval justice, however, knew better than that, and few can say it was always or altogether wrong. But accommodating herself to circumstances, the unhappy woman went round to all her male relatives, one after the other, piteously supplicating for their help. But in vain. They were all extremely sorry, quite convinced of her innocence, in fact, to be unable to come forward, but they could not face Gontran, a terrible man of his hands. Base and cowardly relatives they were, says Brantome, perhaps a little harshly. If the claims of kinship are not easily measured now, what must they have been in those dark ages to a timid man, let us say, with perhaps a wife and family? But as it chanced, there was present among the assembly a young Ingelgarius, a boy of 16, whom the countess had held at the baptismal font and caused to be christened with her husband's own name. And he, when he saw his godmother in such dire straits, came forward and flung himself at the king's feet, begging to be allowed to do battle for her. Ah, what a godchild was that! What baptismal virtue! And promptly flung down his gage to Gontran, who received and picked it up. That was the custom of the time, that the appellant threw down a glove for challenge, and the respondent took it up. Sometimes each party went through both ceremonies, and it was called wager of battle, just as in the case of Jean de Gestel of Hainault and Pierre de Bournazel, who picked up his glove in the presence of Charles V, but that is another story. The king, in this case, did everything he could to dissuade the youth from his enterprise, expostulating him in these very words, "My boy, youth and rashness sometimes bring upon him in whom they lodge a heavier burden than he can carry, and he falls beneath it. So be well advised that you are a little too young to fight such a warrior as Gontran. Think better of it, good youth, than to make your first essay at arms on a field of mortal combat." But in spite of this fair remonstrance, the intrepid young count persisted in his resolve. Though all the court thought it a great pity that so young a child should be given up to butchery and execution. But the countess, on her part, we are told, was glad enough. She hailed him with passionate gratitude, protesting the strength of her innocence and that he might well fight boldly in such a true cause. The contest was accordingly appointed for the next morning at 10. The Count, after greeting and adieu to his godmother, attended Mass, recommended his soul to God, and a due bequest of alms and offerings, and adorned with the victorious sign of the cross, mounted his horse, and entered the lists, where he found his enemy all ready. The Countess was summoned, the usual oaths taken on one side and the other, and then the combatants met in headlong charge. Gontran indeed struck and pierced the young Count's shield through and through, but Ingelgarius, on the other hand, drove his lance right into the doughty Gontran's body, in spite of shield, armor, and all, bore him to the earth, and springing from the saddle, cut off his head, and presented it to the king, who was as well pleased thereat as if one had given him a city. Then was the Countess promptly released, and made her humble thanks to the king, though one does not quite see what he had done to earn them. And before all the assembly she embraced and kissed the dear boy, her godson, to whom moreover were given of the king's bounty lands and estates in Gastinos and the lordship of Chasteau Landon, for which he thenceforth did loyal homage. And the Countess, she lived thereafter a pious life of fasting, prayer, and good works till she died. This story, you are to understand, illustrates the ancient usage in France as to wager of battle and the admission of knights who claimed to accuse or defend by their personal prowess or defend the life and honor of ladies. Brantome believed the practice originated with King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, who, among other chivalrous ordinances, undertook and solemnly vowed to defend ladies and fight for their lives, goods, and honor, as may be seen from abundant examples in the old chronicles and romances. Thus, when the brave Renaud de Montauban arrived in Scotland, having been sent by Charlemagne to ask for succor, he delivered from death and the stake the beauteous Minerva, who was at the point of despair, and made her base slanderer undergo the penalty he had intended for this fair creature. As to mercy, there was no talk of that in such cases. You either died or surrendered, and surrender itself was far worse than any death, because 10 times as shameful. Besides that, the victor, as has been said, could deal with the vanquished just as he pleased. Kill him, keep him prisoner, use him as a slave, sell, hire out, or pledge, or give him away. In another place, we have been told the story of Queen Jean of Naples, also recounted by Dr. Paris de Putio in his interesting work on the subject of duels. This beauteous queen, once on the occasion of a splendid and gorgeous entertainment, when she gave a ball in the great hall of her chateau of Gayet, did so honor the Lord Galeazzo of Mantua as to choose him for a partner in the dance. When it was over, that nobleman went on bended knee to thank her, and scarcely knowing by what service to repay such a condescension, vowed that he would ride knight-errant through all the world, facing all dangers and deeds of high emprise against all other cavaliers he might encounter by the way, till he had conquered by his own prowess, and brought to her Majesty's feet 2 gallant knights as prisoners, and presented them to her to do what she pleased with. Such a practice, however inconvenient to other travelers, was but one of the common courtesies of daily life as practiced by the knight-errant of the good old times toward his lady, and any student of the early chronicles will know well enough how little use it would have been to suggest that the knight might have been much more usefully employed at home. Every age has its fashions, and in that referred to, far from condemning aimless violence or pugnacity as such, men were seriously busied in inventing objects for it. In the present case, fortune was so extremely favorable to the Lord of Mantua that he went no further than Burgundy, Brittany, and England, and was only absent a year before securing the necessary brace of prisoners. Such, however, was the obliging and considerate nature of the princess, the best and most beautiful of her time, we are reminded, and born of the noblest blood of France, that she declined to exercise any single one of the cruel privileges conferred upon her by law, and did not even care to make slaves of the two unfortunate gentlemen. But having received them with the greatest kindness and hospitality, sent them away with handsome presents, equally delighted at her kindness, her beauty, and her generosity, which indeed was natural enough. For, as cannot be too strongly emphasized, she might have done just what she pleased with them. The story, as has been said, is more fully narrated elsewhere. So there can be no real doubt that the aforesaid Dr. Paris was quite right to praise the conduct of the said Queen Jean of Naples, and to censure, if the reader will excuse the abrupt transition, that of the canons of St. Peter at Rome, to which indeed too strong language can hardly be applied. For once, when a certain knight brought them a prisoner, as he had vowed and promised in a fit of penitence, they showed the wretched victim no courtesy or generosity at all. On the contrary, they kept him there for ever so long shut up in the church, one presumes in the capacity of verger or attendant, and if ever he was allowed to look out at the door, that was the utmost liberty allowed the poor wretch, conduct which certainly compares unfavorably with that of the beautiful and generous queen. The reader must surely understand by this time that according to the old-fashioned and orthodox laws, Lombard and other, nothing could be much more degraded than the condition of the conquered man. Thus, every incentive was given to the development of courage and skill in warfare, which was, after all, certainly in Froissart's time, the real business of life. Still, by the close of the 16th century, some real progress had been made, even in the combat à outrance, towards softening these rigors, and quite a number of conquerors had the moderation not to insist on their full rights. There was a fine combat at the siege of Florence, 1530, supervised by that great captain, the Prince of Orange. The story is told by Paolo Giovio, but not so well as Brantome had read in some Spanish chronicle and heard it told at Florence. The whole campaign, as everyone knows, being more an affair of party faction than serious war, two young gentlemen of the besieged party inside the city agreed, as you might expect in such a case, to fight a couple of the besieging party. Either inspired by some peculiar animosity or for the mere fun of the thing, they sent a challenge to the camp of the Prince of Orange and offered to fight any two of their fellow citizens in his army. They were promptly taken at their word by two other brave young Florentines on the prince's side, and the morrow was duly appointed for the combat and all the correct securities and formalities arranged. Accordingly, after all the usual preliminary ceremonies, the quartet of combatants met in the lists, which were marked out by a stout cord held by the lance-necks, whose spears hedged round the enclosure. They wore no defensive armor at all, but fought just in their clothes, with particularly sharp swords, and it so chanced that the fortune of war was equally favorable to both sides, one of each party being defeated and one victorious. There was nothing to complain of in the valor of any of the combatants, who all comported themselves with absolute propriety. But one of the besieged party, being desperately wounded and weakened from loss of blood, when called upon to surrender, could not quite bring himself to utter the fateful formula, and so determined only to answer, "I surrender to His Highness." "There's no highness here but me, I would have you know," was the prompt reply of the enemy. "So surrender yourself to me, and make no mistake." And at this the other, falling to the ground, made sign that he surrendered, absolutely, not for want of courage, but through the fortune of war. However, the enemy behaved quite respectably, and they parted with equal honors, as has been said, on both sides. That reminds one of the brave answer made by the two cousins to Scipio Africanus in Spain, who, being dispute about a certain lordship which each claimed to belong to him, decided to settle the matter by force of arms. The great Roman general, with his usual tact, suggested that it was a pity for such near relatives to fight about a matter which might be better settled by arbitrators or in a court of law. No, no, replied the fond relatives, who perhaps knew as much as Scipio of the local administration of justice. In such a matter we recognize no judge but the god Mars, and our own good swords. The combat of the Florentines was so famous that Brantome thinks it right to give us the names of both parties alike, as each deserved equal celebrity. On the besieged side fought Dante Calistano, and against him, of those of the besiegers, Bertinello Ballandino, who fought on one side of the lists. On the other side, the comrade of Dante, Ludovico Martinelli, was opposed to Giovanni Bombino. In the end, Dante conquered Bertinello, and without taking any extreme measures on his person, simply left him there, and, as it was not allowed him by the regulations, a point to be noted, to go and help his comrade, went and sat down a comfortable position where he could see the fight and rest himself. Meanwhile, the prince, by the kind permission of the said Dante, had the young Bertinello carried out of the lists and his wounds attended to. Ludovico Martinelli fought against Bombino and reduced him to surrender in the fashion described. Bombino, of course, having uttered the answer specified, was the conquered man, but his opponent treated him generously and not according to the letter of the Lombard laws. Altogether, this was really a very fine contest, the details of which would repay careful study. Once upon a time, when Monsieur de Nemours, Gaston de Foix, the king's lieutenant in Italy, was at Ferrara, there came two gallant Spanish captains, who had heard so much of the renown, chivalry, and courtesy of this brave prince, that, having a quarrel between them, they asked to be allowed to fight before him, to which he freely and courteously assented, taking it as a great compliment that they should prefer him to the Spanish princes, his mortal enemies, and the rulers of Italy, even, for example, to their King Ferdinand. On the appointed day, the two combatants punctually appeared with all their friends, relations, seconds, and supporters, and went through all the proper formalities. It happened, too, that the Duchess of Ferrara was anxious to be present, one of the most beautiful and accomplished princesses of Christendom in that day, whether for beauty of body or mind, and skilled in many languages. So Monsieur de Nemours, who was greatly moved by her charms, wore her colors of gray and black, as the story tells, and a favor which, by the way, he had on his person at the Battle of Ravenna. The combat, then, having been begun and carried out with all due bravery, one of the combatants was so severely wounded and lost so much blood that he was on the point of giving way, even of falling. The enemy pressed hard upon him with his sword at his throat, on which Madame the Duchess, whose kindness and courtesy were quite equal to her beauty and virtue, was so touched with pity that, clasping her hands, she appealed to Monsieur de Nemours to put an end to the combat, so that the victor should not pursue his victory even to his death. But Nemours, esprit as he was firm on this point. He would be her servant in every other way. There was nothing in the world he would not do to oblige, but in this matter he had no power. It was impossible for him to run counter to the laws of the duel. He could not honorably ask an unreasonable favor of the conqueror, or deprive him of that for which he has risked his life. How the fair and virtuous Lucretia took this answer is not recorded, but the dilemma was solved by a comparatively civilized compromise. The second came forward and said, "Signor Azevedo," for this was the name of the victorious combatant. The other was the captain, Sainte Croix. "I know my friend well enough, and that he would rather die than surrender. But as I see he cannot possibly do more, I'll surrender for him." Sensational. Thus Azevedo remained the victor, and rendered thanks to God for it, and was escorted from the lists with pomp and congratulations and rejoicing, while Sainte Croix was quickly attended to and his wound stanched. There, it might be thought, was an end of the matter, but his friends carried him off the field with his arms, thus raising another curious point of etiquette. Azevedo subsequently sent for these trophies of his victory, which he had, in fact, forgotten to demand at the moment of the surrender, and on their refusal made a formal complaint. This being brought to the ears of Monsieur de Nemours and the Duke of Ferrara, they ordered Monsieur de Bayard to send to Sainte-Croix and tell him the arms must be given up, or else Monsieur de Nemours would have him brought into the lists again, his wound unsewn, and himself put back into exactly the same position in which he had been when his second surrendered for him. On which Sainte-Croix, realizing that the law was against him, and also that he could not help himself, handed the arms to Monsieur de Bayard, who gave them up to the conqueror, as of course was right. Still, there were punctilious people who raised considerable dispute about that. For example, it might be said that if, either through ignorance, forgetfulness, or any reason, you left your enemy's arms on the field, you had no right to send and demand them afterwards. This was a matter, like so many others, which only experts could decide. Brantome assures us he could have written a long essay on the subject full of arguments, which we cannot doubt, though his arguments seldom lead to any kind of conviction. The further details of the fight are more interesting. It seems that Captain St. Croix received such a wound on the upper part of his thigh as laid bare to the bone, and caused such a flow of blood that in trying to advance and revenge the blow he fell. On seeing that, Azevedo observed, "Surrender, St. Croix, or I'll kill you," to which poor St. Croix answered never a word, but sat down grasping his sword, and resolved to die first. Then Azevedo said to him, "Get up, I can't strike you like that." Besides, it looked dangerous, the story says, with a man so desperate and so courageous. Then he got up and succeeded in walking 2 steps and fell again, this time with his face to the earth, and Azevedo had in fact raised his sword once to cut off the poor man's head, as he might easily have done, had he wished, but drew it back again. Still nothing would induce St. Croix to surrender, and it was at that moment the Duchess tried to intervene on his behalf, for he was at the last gasp, and had he remained so any longer, must have died from loss of blood. We are to admire the pleasing device, genteel invention, of the second surrendering for his principal, but on that point too, there was a great deal to be said. Could one consider such a surrender to be valid? If it were so, was it honorable to the principal concerned? These and a host of other questions could only be decided by really experienced duelists. Azevedo, by the way, was much honored by the French, conducted in triumph with trumpets and clarions to the quartets of Monsieur de Nemours, and received with every hospitality, which, it seems, he repaid later with base ingratitude. So says the story, but without specifying details. It seems probable that he allied himself formally with the enemies of France and fought against Monsieur de Nemours. In this duel, it is further to be observed that Azevedo was the assailant, and his second Federigo de Bonzolo of the House of Gonzaga. Not knowing what weapons he might have to fight with, he brought every kind you could think of for use as a man-at-arms, on jennet-back or on foot. Azevedo was in the lists when the Prior of Messina, the third priest we have heard of as mixed up with these decidedly lay proceedings, brought him 2 casquettes, 2 sharp rapiers, and 2 daggers, out of which he made his choice. Just then, Sainte-Croix appeared on the scene. Both combatants knelt down and said their prayers. They were then examined by the seconds to see if they had any arms or charms concealed on their clothes or on their persons, of which precaution more will be heard presently. Then the lists were emptied, and no one was left there but the 2 combatants, the 2 seconds, and the good Captain Bayard, who was appointed master of the lists by Monsieur de Nemours and the Duke of Ferrara, partly to do him honor, partly because there was nobody in the world who understood these things so well. Then the herald began and made his usual proclamation that nobody should make a sound, spit, or cough, or do anything to disturb the combatants. Then they advanced, one against the other, Azevedo carrying his dagger in one hand and his rapier in the other, while Sainte-Croix kept his dagger in its sheath and carried only his rapier. That the combat was to be mortal, none could doubt, for they wore no kind of defensive armor. And so, after the exchange of one or two blows, came about what has been described. That was the end of the combat, a fine and remarkable one, in which, as in that of the four Florentines, there are a variety of things to be observed. The first question, as already mentioned, is that of the surrender by the second for his principal, and whether it can be regarded as valid, which certainly would not seem to be the case according to the ancient Lombard laws. At least, that was the opinion of many gallant gentlemen and experts with whom our author has discussed the subject. Another point concerns the courtesies which these gentlemen combatants used to each other, not taking advantage of the letter of the law, nor imposing the vile and ignominious conditions it allowed. Here there is no doubt Azevedo behaved with unusual generosity. It is true there are some people who, when they see a brave enemy driven to desperation, are a little afraid to come to close quarters, for there is hardly anything more dangerous than a man mortally wounded, who will sometimes make astonishing efforts to spring at you like a furious lion. In such cases, a judicious and experienced combatant commonly contrives to keep a little way off, if he can, only from fear of these last efforts of fury and bravery, just as the Seigneur de Yarnac did to Brantome's unfortunate uncle, to whom we are thus brought back again. Yarnac, after he had hamstrung him, took precious care to come nowhere near, for he knew Chastaigneraye well enough to be one of the most valiant and determined men in the world, one whose desperate fury must be avoided. In fact, the other did make two alarming attempts to spring at him, and Yarnac, in fear of another, temporized and waited around till the king threw down his baton. The third thing to be noticed is the language used by the Florentine to his antagonist, that there was no other prince in the lists but himself, and the remark of Monsieur de Nemours to the Duchess that he had no power over the victorious party in a duel. All which is true enough, according to the ancient laws, though for that matter there had been kings, princes, lords, sovereigns, and their generals who, observing the abuses and atrocities that had come into use when they allowed a duel, reserved to themselves right and authority to control it as they pleased. For instance, King Francis did this at the combat of Sarze and Veniers, which was fought at Moulins on the return from the field of Piedmont. For, not wishing to see the thing come to extremes in this combat, he threw down his baton and ended it, as is well described in the memoirs of Monsieur du Bellay, which Brantome would not trouble to transcribe, as it was written fully and fairly in that book. He had heard it, too, from the late constable himself in Moulins, in the very place he was bound to remember, for it happened there, and when he was appointed to his office. The king, for that matter, Francis I, threw down his baton in just the same matter at Fontainebleau, in the case of that combat between Julian Romero and the other Spaniard. That, however, was rather because they would neither of them fight seriously, but engaged in trifling with words and gestures and maneuvers, as far as one could make out from those that were there. Henry II, of course, did the same in the Chastaigneraye duel. He threw down his baton, that is, but too late. It is to be observed that this throwing down of the baton, which the king or presiding authority had in his hand or drew at these crises, had such rigorous force of law in it that it was as much as his life was worth for either combatant to go on fighting, or even to finish the stroke he was on the very point of delivering. Down came the judges, marshals, and keepers of the lists, and separated the parties directly. The Grand Master, de Chaumont, the king's lieutenant at Milan, also gave a field to 2 Spaniards who requested it at Parma. One was Peralto, who had been in the service of the King of France and was afterwards killed by a blow from what they used to call a falcon at La Fosse when Jehan Jacques was pursuing the army of the Pope. The other man was a Captain Aldano. They fought on horse, that is, on jennet back, with rapier, poniard, as it was called then, and each of them, after the fashion of Joab when he went to attend the Absalom, 3 darts in his hand. Peralto's second was a Spaniard, and Aldano's that nice Captain Millard. It had snowed so heavily that they fought in the piazza at Parma, where it had been cleared away with no barrier but the heaps of snow. Both did very creditably, and Du Chaumont, who was arbitrator, dismissed them with equal honors. Thus we see how various kings, princes, and judges of the lists have assumed certain powers of control over the duel to mollify its rigors and prevent things coming to extremities. And they were really quite right. It is scarcely becoming for a Christian prince or lord to take a horrid delight in feasting his eyes on such inhuman barbarities, seeing that even the lion, the proudest and most cruel of all animals, when he has once overcome his enemy and brought him to ground, leaves him there and goes off quite contentedly. So Brantome. Modern naturalists may note that the habits of lions have since deteriorated, while those of men have noticeably improved. It is true there is always Bayard to be remembered. One of his most famous feats of arms, by the way, was a combat he fought at Naples against a certain gallant Spanish captain, Don Alonso de Sotomayor. He had been a prisoner at war of Bayard's, and feeling dissatisfied with the board or lodging provided him, went about afterwards saying that he had not been treated at all properly or as a gentleman. A perfectly ridiculous complaint, because everyone in the world knew that his host was the most considerate and courteous man alive. After a time, Bayard, becoming rather bored with these proceedings of the Spaniard, sent him a challenge, offering to meet him man to man in the lists, which Sotomayor accepted with alacrity, undertaking to fight on horse, foot, or anyhow rather than withdraw the aspersions he had made. Still, his bravery was not devoid of a certain tactful prudence, as will be seen. On the appointed day, Bayard appeared mounted on a splendid charger and dressed all in white, in token of his humility, the story said, escorted by my lord de la Police and 200 gentlemen, thinking that the combat would be on horseback. Don Alonso, however, who, as the challenged party, had choice of arms, decided they should fight on foot. He was not so good a horseman as Bayard, so he said, but the real reason was that the latter had a touch of ague upon him that day, a complaint that had troubled him for a year or two past, and the ingenious Sotomayor thought to turn this weakness of the great man into his own advantage. He was considerably taken aback when the latter accepted at once with the utmost alacrity, but there was no getting out of it then. The steed was saddled, as the saying is, though Bayard's seconds, by the way, wanted him to raise an objection on the ground of his illness, but the Chevalier would not hear of such a thing. In these little matters he was ever ready to oblige anyone and fight them just as they pleased. The lists were marked out only with a few large stones put one upon another. Monsieur de Bayard took his place at one end, supported by a number of gallant captains, such as Monsieur de la Police, Dorozay, Dimbecourt, and Fauntleroy, the Baron de Beard, and others, who all joined in prayer for their champion. Don Alonso stood at the other end with his friends, the Marquis de Liede, de Diego de Quinones, lieutenant of the great Gonzalo Hernando, Don Pedro de Balde, and Francisco d'Altamira, and dispatched to Bayard the arms selected, which were a spear and a dagger, the combatants wearing gorgets and close helmets. Bayard again made no difficulty about the choice of arms. His second was a certain Belarbray, an old companion in arms, and his keeper of the lists, Monsieur de la Police, who was well skilled in such matters, while Francisco d'Altamira acted for the Spaniard. Both combatants, having entered the lists, as aforesaid, each knelt down to pray, but Bayard laid himself down flat to kiss the earth, and on rising made the sign of the cross, and then advanced toward his enemy as confidently, so says the story, as if he had entered some palace hall to dance with fair ladies. Don Alonso, on his side, was no whit less at his ease, and, marching straight up to his enemy, asked of him, "Sir Bayard, what would you of me?" To which Bayard replied, "To defend my honor." And without another word they met and dealt each other fierce thrusts. Alonso was slightly wounded on the face, and several blows were exchanged without any further result. Bayard, then noticing his adversary had a trick of delivering a blow and then parrying so that he could not be hurt, bethought him of a counter device, and when the Spaniard raised his arm to deliver his thrust, the Chevalier raised his too, but delayed the stroke, and when that of the enemy had missed him, made such a deadly thrust that the lance, for all the stoutness of the gorget, went 4 good inches into the man's throat, so that he could not get it out again. Don Alonso, feeling that he was wounded to death, closed with his antagonist, who wrestled with him, and in the struggle both fell to the earth one on the other. But Monsieur de Bayard, with great promptness, drew his dagger and held it to the Spaniard's nostrils, crying, "Surrender, Senor Alonso, or you are a dead man." The observation, however, fell on deaf ears, for the man was dead already. Thanks for listening to the first hour of Dueling Stories from the 16th Century. The full audiobook will be released shortly. If you'd like to make sure you're on top of that, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, as X will only allow me to release an hour or 2 at a time, so I'm not going to release the full thing there in lots of little snippets. And after the audiobook is released, you can start to look for full episodes of the Memory Medieval podcast, which will be coming shortly after.